You shouldn't play with strangers. She wouldn't like that. She doesn't like it when you play with anyone but her.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this video looking at Layers of Fear 2. It's a sequel, hence the 2 in the title. And I never got a chance to talk about the original. Another person reviewed it for DDNet, and I never had the excuse to write about it or do a video about it or anything like that, despite really enjoying it. So I'm going to remedy that with this video. I'm going to talk about what I love about Layers of Fear as a general thing, and why I think this is one of the better new horror franchises that has emerged in recent years, despite being a game that doesn't really have any physical danger. It's certainly not Resident Evil or Silent Hill or The Evil Within. It's a very different type of horror, but I think it's a particularly effective one, and I think it's well worth playing. So here we go. So Layers of Fear and its sequel are, to use the pejorative, walking simulators. There's no real physical threat in this game. It's more about the psychological story that it's telling. You don't need to pick up guns, you don't need to shoot enemies, although there is a scene where you do pick up a gun, but it's more to use it's more as a narrative motif or a narrative trick. So there's no real game overs, there's no real monsters popping out of corners to attack you. It's more about that, following a linear path, picking up the occasional note to get information, solving the occasional puzzle just to make sure that there's a bit of interactivity in there, but mostly just to experience what is a very strong horror story. And it's a horror story that is really emphasized through some very creative use of graphical effects, of music, of cinematic techniques, and I'll get to that in a moment. But this game is not the typical horror game. It is a very story-driven one, it's a very narrative-driven one, and it's a very good one. I mean, I play horror games for the narrative, actually. Even the likes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, the combat and that kind of stuff, the puzzle solving and the monsters, they're all kind of secondary. For me, what draws me to horror is the way it tells its story, the way it puts its characters through, hell, often literally, and the way it really taps into a dark side of humanity and a deeper side of I guess, where humanity's fears come from. There's a lot of psychology involved with horror, there's a lot of philosophy, there's a lot of thematic depth. The likes of Stephen King have written extensively about the deeper side of horror. The side that's not about monsters jumping out at you and attacking you, the more intense stuff, the stuff that kind of digs inside your soul and has you dwelling on it for weeks and months on end. If a horror game is good, that's the side of things that attracts me. And like I said, even Resident Evil and Silent Hill, they actually have strong horror stories in one way or another, in the way that they do what they're doing with the storytelling, and that's why I like them. Layers of Fear and its sequel are kind of pure examples of that narrative storytelling within horror, and that's what attracts me to them, and that's what I found immediately very appealing about these games. And Layers of Fear was a good start. Layers of Fear 2 is in so many ways an improvement on that. Not so much the gameplay, because again it's a walking simulator, to use that term. It doesn't play any differently really to Layers of Fear. What it does so much differently is the narrative and the thematics, and it's a game that really appeals to basically everything that I like about horror games. So the original Layers of Fear was an intense look at the creative process from the point of view of a visual artist, a painter in that case. And it was a really deep kind of exploration about how the creative process can mess with the mind, and the intense experience that you have as an artist in making a painting, what you put into it, where the inspiration comes from, and the way that the focus and the intensity of that creative process can really affect you. There was a whole lot of other things going on in there, of course, in that game, and it blew out into some silly places at times, but the core of it was that very strong area that I can identify with. I've written a book and I know the kind of process in creating something that that dense, that weighty, that extensive, the months of work that goes into it, the effort that you need to put into it, all of that kind of stuff I'm well familiar with, so I could relate to the themes and the issues that Layers of Fear was really bringing up. Layers of Fear 2 continues that tradition in a different way. It looks at a different form of art, where Layers of Fear was about the visual artist and the painter. This one's more about cinema and the role of actors and directors and everybody involved with making a film, and the intense experience that goes into putting a film together as opposed to a painting. That's a really appealing topic, of course, because filmmaking is such an interesting form of art and creation, because it involves such a huge scale and so many kind of smokes and mirrors in terms of making it happen. What goes on behind the scenes and what you see at the end product is so very disconnected from one another, and the process that actors go through to really inhabit a role, and the process that a director goes through to design the sets and to really make the magic happen, what goes into the cinematography in terms of the limiting of the view, so that you as a cinematographer, you have to see the world through a small square, and you need to be able to block out everything else that goes on around it, because that context of what goes on around outside the square can change what happens inside the square, and vice versa. If you want to create a certain effect inside a square, you need to be able to block out what's going on outside of that space. So all of these things and all of this thought and all this consideration that goes into making a film can really create some very distorted views on the world. And I think that at the core of what Layers of Fear 2 does so well is really explore that in just about every way possible. It really shows, I guess, the intensity of filmmaking and the impact of that. And again, it's a story that goes into some very silly places at times, but again, the thematic core of it is just so appealing and so interesting. What I really love about Layers of Fear 2 is the way that the game is actually designed around that cinematic experience as well. So it is a very cinematic game to play. The way it shifts between black and white sections to really celebrate, in a way, the origins of filmmaking. The way it jumps onto sets and then turns them into some very creepy places to explore in their own right, because they're so artificial and yet so sinister. The way it works with prop dolls to turn them into something quite sinister. The way that it uses light is especially inspired, because it has those film reels that shoot out the light constantly, and you need to, and it has a way of creating this amazing contrast between light and dark, which is also very cinematic. And every step you take in Layers of Fear is kind of an intense cinematic experience in its own right, and that's really appealing to me as somebody who has obviously studied film and really enjoyed pulling apart what makes a film happen. I've spent time looking at how lighting works in film. I've spent time looking at how black and white films were made differently to films in colour, and how set design has evolved over time as well. All of these things come together in Layers of Fear in a really appealing way, and it was just a really enjoyable game to walk through. It's even got the kind of the markers on the ground to show you, those are set directions to show the actors where they need to move, and so on and so forth. And it's just such an authentic cinematic experience, and it just really drew me in, and I just kept pushing through, because I just wanted to see what was going to come up next, how the game was going to up itself, up its intensity, up its creativity, and it always found a way of doing so, which is really impressive. It's very hard to do, especially when it starts at such a high note as it does in this. What you're seeing on the screen in front of you is just the first chapter, and as you can see, it's already got that kind of gorgeous glow of cinema and the authentic, I guess, nature of cinema, and it's got some really kind of key scenes that are very dramatic and very powerful and very beautifully constructed. So this is just the first scene, the first act, and I'm not going to show any more than that in this video, because I want you to experience it for yourself. But that process of escalation in Layers of Fear 2 is really impressive. I'm amazed at how well the developers have done there. Now, Layers of Fear 2 is a fairly quiet game. It's fairly reflective, a bit like its predecessor. It uses music in a very subtle way to build tension. It doesn't have too many of the loud bangs. It's not a jump scare kind of game. It has a couple of moments which are designed to kind of hit you with a quick jump scare, and then you move on. But it's more about I guess that slow build up and that intensity, and the themes and the story that it's exploring is so fundamentally dark and horrific that that's what the game really relies on in terms of its horror atmosphere. And it has a great horror atmosphere. It doesn't take you long to kind of put aside the knowledge that you're in no kind of real physical threat. There's no game over screen ahead of you. A lot of people seem to think that with horror, without that game over screen threatening you, it's hard to create a sense of horror, but I think that Layers of Fear and its sequel really prove otherwise. There's never a sense that you're under physical threat, and yet there's a tension within you as you play this game, because it just does such a good job of dressing things up and making sure that you feel like you're in a very kind of creepy environment. It's kind of like if you go to a show and it's got a haunted house, it's a little bit like that, where you know that you're not in any real danger. I mean, that's not the point of the haunted house. It's more about the way that things kind of creep you out as you go through it. But in a haunted house, it's much more a focus on the jump scares. In something like Layers of Fear, where there's a much stronger narrative element, it's more about paying attention to what the story's saying, and that's where the sense of horror comes from. Now, I could talk on and on and on about how this game has really impressed me to the point that I've lost my voice and you're all very bored of me, if you're not already very bored of me. So I'm going to stop talking about Layers of Fear right now. What I will say is that I do have a review coming up on digitally-downloaded.net. And I can say that that's going to be very positive in tone, very, very positive. I'm a big fan of Bloober Team and what they're doing with the horror genre. In addition to Layers of Fear and its sequel, they have another title called Observation. I'm not quite sure. I keep getting it confused with Devolver Digital's Observe or Observer. There's a lot of variations of Observe out there in video game horror space, but Bloober Team has one that has Rutger Hauger doing the voice work for a cyberpunk style horror game as well, and it's also very effective in a very similar way. They're very good at creating these horror games that don't rely on silly jump scares, gunplay and all that stuff to really draw you in, and I'm a huge fan of this developer. I think they're doing amazing things. I think Layers of Fear 2 is a sequel I didn't know that I wanted to Layers of Fear. I thought that Layers of Fear was perfectly self-contained and didn't need one, but this game shows that there's legs in this franchise yet. I don't know if there'll be a third after this. I assume that sales will matter, but I think that if this is going to be an ongoing franchise, they're in a very good place, and they have a very talented team of storytellers that really understand the artistic process, the creative process, and how to work with that to create an interesting video game, and something that's scary, that does everything that you want from a horror game, but is a little bit more high-minded, for want of a better word, and tries to be a little bit more intelligent than the typical gunplay horror games. So that's me. Please do play this game. If you are a fan of horror on any level, it's great. If you're not a huge fan of horror games, still play it anyway. It might scare you, but it does have that narrative focus that makes it intriguing anyway, and it doesn't have the jump scares, so you'll be creeped out, but I don't think you'll want to put the controller down as you play this. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoy all my videos, please do back me on Patreon. I really appreciate the support. It helps me do more of them, and I have some great ideas for more stuff, but I need those subscribers, I need those Patreon supporters in order to have the money to do so. So thanks as always for watching my videos, and thanks for your support, and we will see you at the next video.